At 4:45 a.m. on September 1st, 1939, the sky above the Polish town of Wilu was still dark. The streets were empty. Shops were closed. Children slept. There were no soldiers stationed there, no military factories, no defensive positions. At exactly that moment, the first bombs fell. They did not target troops. They targeted homes. Within minutes, the town hospital was burning. Civilians ran barefoot through shattered glass. Church bells collapsed into rubble. By sunrise, Wilu was nearly destroyed. More than 1,000 people were dead. No declaration of war had been delivered. No warning had been given. World War II had begun not with a battlefield clash, but with ordinary people caught in the first breath of something vast and uncontrollable. At the same hour, across the border, armored columns rolled forward. Trains crossed lines drawn decades earlier by diplomats who'd never imagined this morning. Radios crackled with coded messages. Orders written months before were finally executed. But this war did not begin that morning. It had been forming quietly for years, in cafes and ministries, in speeches that turned fear into permission, in treaties signed with forced smiles, in economies strangled by debt and resentment. The bombs over Wilu were not a spark. They were the release of pressure that had been building since the last war ended. For the people waking beneath falling masonry, none of that context mattered. They did not know they were witnessing the opening scene of the deadliest conflict in human history. They only knew the sound, the shaking, the smoke that turned dawn into night. History often tells us wars start with dates and signatures. But wars truly begin when ideas harden into certainty and compromise becomes weakness. By September 1939, Europe had reached that point. This is not the story of a single invasion or a single leader. It is the story of how exhaustion, fear, revenge, and silence combined to make war feel inevitable, and how the world, step by step, walked into it. The end of World War I did not bring peace. It brought unfinished business. In 1919, the Treaty of Versailles attempted to redraw Europe and punish those blamed for the previous conflict. Borders were shifted, armies were limited, economies were burdened with reparations. The treaty was written to prevent another war, but it planted resentment instead. Millions of veterans returned home to countries that no longer knew how to absorb them. Inflation erased savings. Political movements fed on humiliation. Across Europe, democracy felt fragile, experimental, and slow. Germany was not alone in its instability. Italy struggled with unrest. Eastern Europe fractured into new states with old grudges. The Soviet Union emerged isolated and suspicious. Meanwhile, Britain and France were exhausted, economically strained, and desperate to avoid another catastrophe. Into this landscape stepped leaders who spoke in absolutes. They promised restoration, security, national pride. They identified enemies within and beyond borders. They framed compromise as betrayal. These figures did not invent anger. They organized it. At the same time, the international system designed to prevent war was weak. The League of Nations had no army. Its warnings carried no enforcement. When agreements were violated, responses were slow and cautious. Each violation tested the limits. When one border was crossed without consequence, another followed. When treaties were ignored without punishment, they lost meaning. Appeasement was not born from ignorance, but from fear. Leaders remembered the trenches. They remembered mass graves. They believed delay might prevent disaster. Instead, delay reshaped it. Economic collapse accelerated the process. The Great Depression shattered global trade. Unemployment radicalized populations. Extremist solutions sounded practical to people with nothing left to lose. By the mid-1930s, the structure holding Europe together was hollow. Alliances were uncertain. Promises were conditional. Military planning resumed quietly, justified as defense. Ordinary people noticed the changes first in small ways. Newspapers grew harsher. Neighbors disappeared. Youth groups marched. Factories shifted production. Language changed. Words like security and purity replaced nuance. The world did not sleepwalk into war. It argued itself there. By 1939, leaders across continents believed conflict could be controlled, localized, or redirected. They were wrong. The machinery was already in motion, and once motion begins at that scale, stopping it requires courage that few systems are built to allow. The people of Wilu would learn that truth before the rest of the world could admit it. The final steps toward global war were not sudden. They were methodical. One by one, limits were tested. Troops entered regions claimed as defensive measures. Referendums were organized under pressure. Agreements were signed and then quietly broken. Each move reshaped expectations. What had once been unthinkable became negotiable. What had been illegal became tolerated. Diplomacy shifted from principle to damage control. Meanwhile, military technology transformed warfare itself. Tanks replaced cavalry. Aircraft turned cities into targets. Radio allowed commands to move faster than consequences. War was no longer confined to front lines. Civilians were now part of the battlefield, whether they agreed or not. In Asia, conflict had already begun years earlier. In Africa, imperial tensions simmered. These wars were often treated as separate, distant, manageable. They were not. They were rehearsals. The idea that peace could be preserved by ignoring aggression elsewhere proved dangerously false. At the center of this transformation was a belief shared by many governments that war could be timed, shaped, or limited. Leaders believed they could choose the moment. That belief gave them confidence to delay confrontation. But war does not wait for consensus. By August 1939, Europe stood balanced on language that no longer matched reality. Public statements promised peace. Private communications prepared for war. Alliances shifted overnight. Neutrality became temporary. When the final diplomatic efforts failed, the mechanisms activated without hesitation. Trains moved, borders closed, orders executed. The system did exactly what it had been built to do, and it did not ask permission from those beneath it. The invasion of Poland did not just trigger declarations of war, it shattered the illusion that modern conflict could be restrained. Within weeks, civilians were refugees, governments collapsed, economies mobilized for destruction. The war expanded not because it was planned as global, but because the world was already interconnected. Trade routes became supply lines, colonies became battlefields, oceans became frontiers. World War II did not start because one morning someone chose violence. It started because violence had been normalized, justified, and deferred for too long. By the time the bombs fell on Wilu, the decision had already been made by years of silence, compromise, and fear. And from that moment forward, history would no longer ask how to prevent the war. It would ask how to survive it. By the autumn of 1939, the impossible idea was no longer whispered. It was spoken aloud in strategy rooms, radio addresses, and closed-door meetings, that this war could be reshaped quickly, decisively, before it consumed everything. Many believed speed was the answer. The logic seemed simple. Strike fast, overwhelm early, force surrender before resistance could organize. Avoid the stalemate that had defined the previous World War. The memory of trenches and endless casualty lists haunted every general staff. No one wanted another frozen front stretching for years. This belief drove decisions that expanded the conflict instead of containing it. Across Europe, governments mobilized not only armies, but entire societies. Factories, railways were scheduled to the minute. Civilians were instructed how to black out windows, ration food, and prepare shelters. War planning moved from maps to kitchens. At the same time, diplomacy collapsed under its own contradictions. Alliances were declared defensive while preparing offensive options. Neutrality was promised while borders were quietly reinforced. Every nation feared being struck first, and that fear justified striking preemptively. The impossible idea took root in many forms: that a single campaign could force peace, that air power alone could break morale, that civilians would endure bombing and still submit. That war could be controlled by those who started it. None of these assumptions had been tested at this scale. As winter approached, the conflict widened. Naval blockades choked trade, submarines hunted shipping lanes. Neutral waters became dangerous by proximity alone. Each engagement pulled new regions closer. What made this moment uniquely dangerous was not just military movement, but certainty. Leaders spoke as if outcomes were inevitable. That confidence silenced doubt. Dissent became disloyalty. Questioning strategy became weakness. Meanwhile, ordinary people experienced the war not as theory, but as interruption. Trains stopped running. Letters arrived late or not at all. Food disappeared from shelves. Young men vanished into uniforms. The impossible idea promised control. What it delivered was momentum. As 1940 approached, the war crossed a psychological threshold. It was no longer a regional crisis. It was a test of systems, ideologies, and endurance. Every success demanded a larger one to justify its cost. Every failure required escalation to recover credibility. The belief that the war could still be shaped led directly to decisions that ensured it could not. And once those decisions were made, the world moved from preparation to execution. Execution began with speed, surprise, and scale unseen before. Armored formations bypassed expected defenses. Aircraft struck deep beyond front lines. Communications were disrupted. Civilian populations found themselves behind advancing forces overnight. The war moved faster than governments could explain it. Cities fell in days. Borders collapsed in hours. Radio broadcasts attempted reassurance while evacuation columns stretched for miles. Roads filled with carts, bicycles, livestock, and children carrying what they could hold. Air attacks did not distinguish between retreating soldiers and families fleeing with nowhere to go. The strategy worked tactically. It failed humanly. Each successful maneuver generated consequences planners had not calculated. Refugees overwhelmed regions unprepared to support them. Occupation required resources that had not been allocated. Resistance movements formed where submission had been expected. The war expanded vertically as well as horizontally. Bombers reached further. Anti-aircraft fire thickened skies. Civilian casualties rose sharply, not as accidents, but as byproducts of strategic doctrine. Governments justified destruction as necessity. They spoke of morale, production, and inevitability. Language distanced decision makers from results. Words replaced faces, yet the faces remained. Firefighters pulling bodies from rubble. Nurses working without sleep. Children learning to identify aircraft by sound. These were not side effects. They were the war. As battles intensified, alliances hardened, neutral nations felt pressure from all sides. Trade became leverage. Resources became targets. The war's logic absorbed everything it touched. The impossible idea collapsed under its own weight. No campaign ended the conflict. No decisive blow restored balance. Instead, each victory required another. Each defeat demanded retaliation. By late 1941, the war crossed its final boundary. It became global not by declaration alone, but by inevitability. Oceans were no longer barriers. They were corridors. The execution phase revealed the truth that preparation had obscured. Modern war could not be limited once unleashed. Systems built for efficiency became engines of destruction. Human judgment was overwhelmed by process. What began with a belief in control ended with surrender to scale. And as the world burned across continents, the question was no longer how the war had started. It was how much it would take before it ended. When the fighting finally ended in 1945, the question of how the war began returned with urgency. The scale of destruction demanded explanation. Entire cities lay flattened. Millions were dead. Borders had shifted, governments collapsed, and societies were permanently altered. Historians would later agree on one central truth: World War II did not begin with a single shot, but with a sequence of decisions made long before September 1939 Each step narrowed the options of those who followed. By the time armies crossed borders, the conflict had already become unavoidable. The war exposed the danger of unresolved injustice, economic collapse, political humiliation, and unaddressed grievances created conditions where extreme solutions seemed reasonable. Fear became policy, revenge became strategy, compromise became weakness. International systems failed because they relied on good faith without enforcement. Agreements existed, but consequences did not. When violations went unanswered, they became precedents. When violence was tolerated once, it returned magnified. The conflict also revealed the limits of technology as salvation. Machines accelerated warfare but did not shorten it. Air power devastated cities but did not break civilian will. Speed created chaos faster than it created peace. World War II reshaped global power permanently. Empires weakened, new superpowers emerged, institutions were rebuilt with the explicit goal of preventing another such collapse. Yet those institutions carried the memory of failure within their foundations. The war's beginning became a warning studied by future generations that peace is not maintained by hope alone, but by accountability, restraint, and the courage to confront injustice early. Its historical significance lies not only in what happened, but in what was ignored before it began. For those who lived through it, the beginning of the war was not a date. It was a moment when normal life cracked. A shop that never reopened, a letter that never arrived, a voice on the radio that spoke calmly while the world changed forever. Survivors remembered confusion more than certainty. Few understood the full picture. They knew only that choices made far away had reached their streets, their homes, their families. Years later, many asked the same question: could it have been stopped? The answer is uncomfortable. Not because it is simple, but because it is shared. The war began when warning signs were dismissed, when cruelty was tolerated if it targeted others, when stability was valued over justice. The legacy of World War II is not only memorials in history books, it is the responsibility passed forward. Each generation inherits the consequences of silence as much as action. The people who endured the war carried no illusions about glory. They spoke instead of hunger, fear, loss, and endurance. Their stories remind us that war does not begin with soldiers. It begins with decisions. Understanding how World War II actually started is not about assigning blame to one moment or one nation. It is about recognizing patterns that repeat when power goes unchecked and humanity is divided into categories. The war ended in victory for some, survival for others, and grief for nearly all. Its beginning remains a lesson written in human cost. This is the history of World War II. Whoever oppresses the innocent is an oppressor. Neither the earth belongs to this oppressor, nor does the sky belong to him. We stand now and forever with the oppressed. 3 important questions for the audience. 1. What were the true hidden causes that led to the outbreak of World War II? 2. How did the alliances and betrayals shape the first spark of this global conflict? 3. Could the war have been avoided if different decisions were made at critical moments? This is WW2 Files. See you in the next one.